Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the Voice of Reason. Today, we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the Russian-Ukrainian War. And before I start, I'd like to bid everyone a happy Easter. Hope everyone is having a pleasant Sunday on this holiday weekend. So we're starting off today in the area near Bakhmut. And again, as we had talked about yesterday, the Russians continue to clear out Bakhmut of Ukrainian forces. About half of the defensive line that runs along the railway corridor through what is essentially the west center of the city has now been taken by Russian forces. And again, if we go back and we just look at the last few days of what has happened, and again, pay attention to this area here. As we just go back, you can kind of see what has happened over the course of the last few days. And this is about a week. So not a good sign for the Ukrainians to continue to hold on to Bakhmut. I'd also talked about the possibility that the Ukrainians don't have the ability to get out of Bakhmut, to withdraw from Bakhmut. Now, we've seen some new video intel that adds validity to that scenario. Again, meaning the Ukrainians don't have the ability to withdraw from the Bakhmut area of operations. If we look at some of the video that has been released, you can clearly see that Ukrainian convoys that have been geolocated along various routes in and out of Bakhmut have been utterly obliterated by Russian strikes, either air strikes or artillery strikes against these forces. So if, again, the Ukrainians wanted to do a mass withdrawal outside of seeking Russian permission to conduct such a movement out of Bakhmut, they would get hit very hard with Russian assets. And if we look at the deployment map of kind of what forces are in this noose and continue to be in this noose, it is a significant force construct. You have multiple brigades. You have right now probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 Ukrainian brigades in this area that, again, could be essentially trapped. Now, we don't know that for certain, but what we do know is that the Ukrainian columns that have either tried to make its way into Bakhmut or make its way out of Bakhmut have been interdicted by Russian forces. Again, artillery, drones, aircraft. And the use of larger ordnance by Russian forces are taking a toll on Ukrainian forces. As we talked about in the previous episode, the Russians are now using these ton-and-a-half glide bombs. They're not risking their aircraft by crossing into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. And they're launching these missiles and glide bombs against Ukrainian targets with the help of ground-based and drone-based systems that identify Ukrainian forces. And again, if the Ukrainians were attempting a mass withdrawal from Bakhmut, the Russians are going to know that that is occurring, and the Ukrainians know that the Russians know that would be occurring. And if that did happen, again, given kind of the terrain, the territory, and the amount of Russian forces that have been compiled in this area, and again, not just army units, Wagner units, aircraft, air power, artillery, again, makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to make its way out of Bakhmut. Now, we keep hearing about this possible Ukrainian counteroffensive. Even in this map, this deployment map that we're looking at tends to be pro-Ukrainian, and you can see that at least the analysts that compile this deployment map believe there are essentially 2 Ukrainian corps, one on the western side of the Dnieper River, one on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, that could be preparing for large-scale offensive operations against Russian forces. Now, probably the only military in the world that knows Russian tactics, the Russian way of war. I mean, obviously the Ukrainians spent decades in the Soviet system. Many of its senior officers were trained inside of Russia. Some of its senior officers were born inside of Russia. So the Ukrainians know the Russian doctrine. Now, obviously, this war is changing that doctrine, and changing that doctrine on both sides, quite frankly. But outside of the Russians knowing the Russians, the Ukrainians know the Russians as well as anyone. And as we look at this possible large offensive operation by the Ukrainians, now we don't know where this is going to occur. There's a lot of talk, again, that it's going to occur in this area here near Zaporizhzhia. And it's going to focus on a drive south to sever this land corridor from Russia to the Crimea. Now, if we know one thing about Russian doctrine, Russian tactics, is the Russians very much enjoy defensive operations that then lead into offensive operations. So if the Russians are aware that Ukrainian forces are preparing for a large-scale offensive operations towards Melitopol, towards the Crimea, wherever they're trying to attack at in Zaporizhzhia area, this area here, the Russians are also planning something. I mean, if we look back in history, if we look back, for example, look at the Battle of Kursk, and you look at the preparation, you look at the amount of German forces that were used against the Soviet Union. And then obviously the Battle of Kursk, Operation Citadel, then became something else. It became a Russian or Soviet massive counteroffensive. Over 2 million troops, 7,000 tanks. After the fairly unsuccessful Battle of Kursk occurred, Citadel, very effective defensive operation by the Russians, wearing out the Germans, and then launching that massive counteroffensive. I would say look at history and watch history very, very closely, because the Russians do. And I would have to assume that if, in fact, the Ukrainians are truly planning an offensive towards Melitopol or in the south, that they're being very, very careful and understand that the Russians are very, very dangerous when countering offensive operations, when they go into that defensive mode and then they launch those counteroffensives. So, again, the Ukrainians really need to be very, very careful about what comes next, and to be very certain about their capabilities to be successful in upcoming operations. I get that they were successful in the battles and the operation that took place east of Kharkov. I understand that the Russian First Guards Tank Army did not perform very well in those battles around Kharkov. We saw the Russians pull out of that area, and the Russians took control. The Ukrainians took control of fairly large areas. We'll go over to the deep state map, and this gives you an idea again of the terrain that the Ukrainians were able to retake. Now, that does not mean that a future offensive operation by the Ukrainians is going to be as successful as what we saw in the east of Kharkov. It's just not. The Russians have been doing a lot of preparation. There's been a lot of mobilization going on by Russian forces. So again, it's difficult to compare and contrast the two operations. It's difficult to look at the operation that took place on the western bank of the Dnieper River, which ultimately was a Russian tactical withdrawal from this area here in green. So again, you have to ask the question, are the Ukrainians truly preparing for an operation in the south? Are they looking at another operation elsewhere? We can tell you that the Ukrainians have been getting bolder in cross-border strikes against Russia proper. The United States has been pushing back against the Ukrainians about launching strikes into the Russian Federation. The United States, I believe at this point, would like the Ukrainians to focus on Russian forces inside of Ukraine. But in the last 24, 48 hours, 72 hours, the last week, we have seen Ukrainian forces launch strikes just across the border, artillery strikes, against Russian forces on the Russian side of the border. So it's interesting to see if the Ukrainians could be preparing something else, something that may not involve the southern sector. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but given the ability of the Ukrainians to kind of surprise in what occurred in Kharkov, I wouldn't put it past them. But again, the Ukrainians have to be very, very careful because the Russians are notorious for these counter operations, reacting, deploying, and engaging an offensive enemy, damaging that attacking force, and then immediately going from the defensive to the offensive on those forces that were heavily damaged in their ensuing attack. So again, it'll be interesting to see. We are continuing to monitor. We'll continue to report. Again, there's a lot of movements on the ground. There's a lot of pieces moving. There's a lot of pieces to the puzzle. And as I had talked about, as we go into the warmer months, things are going to start heating up. I think both sides are going to start to maneuver more. And definitely, I anticipate we are going to see a major Russian operation. We continue to hear about this Ukrainian operation, but the Russians, make no mistake, are preparing for something much, much larger than what we've seen over the course of the last few months. So thanks for joining us today. More to come very, very soon. And again, have a good Easter and have a good day.